Hello and welcome to today's UNICON webinar, Changing the Nature of Leadership. My name's Rob Dietl. I'll be your moderator for today. Delighted to have you all joining us for today's webinar. Very timely topic for us in terms of leadership and the changing nature of leadership. With a lot of the recent headlines and developments in our campuses and around the world, leadership is more important now than ever. And today we're going to tackle just what that means. Today's webinar is based on a research paper from the November 2019 UNICON research report. And we're very fortunate to have two of the researchers here to lead us through the webinar and provide their perspectives. Patricia Hind and Viki Holton will be leading our webinar today, where they're going to talk about the potential for social channels to improve leadership effectiveness in organizations through interaction, content sharing, and collaboration. Before we start, just a few reminders about today's webinar. We will be recording the webinar. We realize that many of your colleagues may not be able to join today, so we thought it was important to be able to provide this to them and to you for after the webinar is completed. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording of the webinar, so please stay tuned for that. Also, I just want to mention briefly, many of you may have seen some of the changes to the upcoming Directors Conference scheduled for next week. As you may realize or have seen, the conference was originally scheduled to be held in Xinhua in Beijing and then was relocated to University of Virginia. And with changes there, that is now being moved to an online format. We're still very confident that the sessions and the content that we'll be able to deliver online will be very helpful. If you have questions about changes to the Directors Conference, we encourage you to visit the UNICON website for updates and the most recent information. This webinar today will be held in compliance with the UNICON antitrust and competition statement that you see on your screen right now. The slides will be available after the webinar, and you receive a link to the recording of the webinar. Will also receive details on how to access a copy of the slides that we cover today. That covers it for us today in terms of housekeeping items. So without any further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our two researchers that are covering. Patricia Hind is Professor of Management Development at Ashridge Executive Education, Hult International Business School. As a business psychologist, she works with private and public sector clients, specializing in leadership, organizational behavior, and change management. Viki Holton is also a senior research fellow at Ashridge Executive Education. Her interests include diversity and inclusion, HR, women's career development, and leadership. She co-authored How to Thrive and Survive as a Working Woman, published by Bloomsbury in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Patricia and Viki. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Well, good afternoon to you all. My name is Patricia Hind, and I'm here with my colleague, Viki Holton. That's us. We also have a third collaborator on this research, Anthony Turner, who's unable to be with us today. But we're going to share with you some of the findings from our research project, which looked at the changing nature of leadership. It was an exploratory investigation into how digitalization, digital communication, in particular, the use of social media, is changing what it means to be an effective leader. We weren't interested particularly in how leaders manage to use it or not, although that was part of the research. We were wondering, basically, what people think of as an effective leader now that we all communicate very differently. So we're going to share some of the findings with you and tell you a little bit about what we did over the next 45 minutes or so. We'd like to hope that a few more people will join us, and if so, we'd be asking you to think of the following questions and to use the chat function to share some of your thoughts. I know that many of you will be practicing leaders. You may be involved in leadership development. You may have big or small teams, but you will be leading in some shape or form. And we were wondering, do you use social media for any part of your leadership role at all? And if yes, what do you use it for? Do you use it for thanking people, encouraging people, or monitoring their performance? Whatever it is, it would be helpful to know what you use it for, how it goes down. Is it effective? Is it an effective way to lead? But if you don't manage to use it, what would be the reason? I'll just pause for a moment and see if any of you can actually think about that and give us a comment or two. Okay, so we've got, I use social media to help with visioning. That's a really good thing. So that's basically communication that may be helpful to others. So giving people more information, which is great. It's very obvious use and one where social media is very effective because of the reach that social media has. Anybody else? No? Okay, well, maybe if you think of something, do please feel free to pop it in that chat box as we go through the session. So I'm just trying to move us on. And that's not happening at the moment. I'm afraid, just bear with me. For some reason, I'm unable to move the slide set on now. I'm going to end the show briefly and take us to the next slide and try again. So, why did we think the topic was important? That's what we're going to talk to you about first. What piqued our interest, if you like. After that, we're going to talk about the actual project that we ran, the methodology that we used, the model of leadership we used, and share some of the results. We've given some thought to what it means for leadership thinking. As many of you know, leadership research has been vast over the many years, and there are many, many publications on leadership each year, different models, different ways of thinking, and we have some thoughts about what social media is doing for that, those ways of thinking. And then, most importantly, how do we as business educators put our findings into practice to help us develop the leaders of tomorrow? So that's today's agenda. What sparked our interest? Well, very topically, it was this. It was the first election of President Donald Trump when he used social media so very, very effectively. And we were struck by how different that campaign was to election campaigns of the past, and also how very, very effective it was. And we began to think, this phenomena is here to stay. What does it mean for leadership? Why is it important? And we know that social media has changed the nature of human interaction quite dramatically. When you think of the information that's available, the information we can share, but also the type of information we can share. It's possible to share our opinions widely, to share personal information widely. So our options as communicators, as connectors when we are leaders, hugely changed by the nature of social media. It's changed how relationships are developed and managed. It's quite easy to say you have several thousand friends on the internet through social media. That's maybe not what everybody thinks of as friendship, but it's a new meaning. It's changed our understanding of the word followership. In previous thinking about leadership, to follow meant that you would be influenced by somebody in a way that affected your behavior and your thought. Now you can follow somebody without being influenced in those ways necessarily. So the changes in communication and relationship management, we think, are absolutely fundamental on all walks of life. And communicating, having influence, managing power, these are things that are important to leadership. So we began to ask ourselves whether we should, as business educators, be thinking about what we're offering in terms of leadership development. What could we do to bring our leadership development offerings up to date, to make sure that it was relevant for the world that our leaders are operating in now, and wondered what we should do differently, what we should keep, what we should just tweak, but whether we really needed to think completely afresh. So that was why we began the project. Other things that influenced us was the actual enormity of this phenomenon. Social media users worldwide in 2019, 3.5 billion, 13% increase year on year. This is enormous. This is a baby that can't be put away again. This is here to stay. 45% of the entire global population, and staggeringly, people spending an average of 3 hours a day on social media sites. So obviously some people spending significantly lower than 3 hours, but some spending an awful lot more. 11 new social media users every second. That's quite scary. But it's obviously something that leaders must address. Global blanket usage such as this will eventually be part of the business world everywhere. We're using it already. We have WhatsApp groups for teams, but perhaps we're not actually using the full functionality of it for leading. And also, we don't know what impact it is having on what we believe to be effectiveness in leadership. And I've put there a quote from one of the executive leaders that we interviewed, which we thought was quite telling. That if the slowest mode of communication you have ever known is email, then your expectations are different and leaders must adapt to survive. People are used to being listened to having their voice heard, and they expect it at work. So in that quote were a few hints to us of what might be going on. First of all, we were alerted to the changing nature of people who are being led. Digital natives, they're called. People who are very social media savvy and do most of their communicating on that. So different set of expectations about what communication is. People used to being listened to and having their voice heard. So that gave us a little bit of an insight into the fact that power dynamics are changing. Top-down communications from leaders no longer sufficient. Well, we've known that for a long time. Democratic leadership, participative leadership have been very, very to the fore in our ways of thinking about leadership. But this is a different dimension. This is pi r squared, expecting people's voices to be heard. So they don't expect just to be listened to, they expect to be responded to. We heard about these differences in our research quite significantly, as well as a lot of other interesting findings. So as I mentioned earlier, leadership thinking has evolved throughout the years, and I'm sure that many of you who are listening to me are very familiar with the changes and the developments in leadership thinking, from what we used to call the great man approach, where leaders were different people, they had different characteristics, and they were very special, and people were led by them because of that. We were talking personality traits and characteristics. And that was blown out of the water really by a guy called Stodgill, who said, no, it's not about what people are, but it's what they do, which of course for us educators was very good news, because we can help people to develop the ability to do different things much easier than we can ask them to be different things. So then we had the behavioral school, which was about leadership skills, leadership behaviors in appropriate settings. And now we're in something called the era of relational leadership. And what that really crystallizes is that leadership is not in the body of a leader, it's not in the behavior of a leader, but it's in the relationship between the leader and the led. And this has been a very, very fruitful area for research. And we've got a lot of robust theories, leader-member exchange theory, social exchange theory, lots of approaches which are very, very sound. And that's where we believe we're playing. This is the field we're playing on, because social media is changing the nature of the relationship between leaders and led. And that's a fundamental shift for both leaders and led that we will talk about later, because there's opportunities in that, but there are also quite significant challenges in that. So looking at the breadth of research about leadership, we needed to distill that into something we could talk to people with. And we distilled that into these three fundamental areas of leadership, or dimensions of leadership functioning. Leaders have to communicate a vision. They have to have a sense of direction. They have to have a sense of change. They need to know where they're going, and they need to be able to communicate that. They have to, these are slightly in the wrong order perhaps, they have to do that with and through others, because you can't lead on your own. And leadership is about mobilizing other people. And in order to do that, you have to have been able to develop trust. Now, those are not the only three key functions of leadership, but they are what we thought were an accessible model or framework with which to discuss leadership to people who don't spend all their lives thinking about what it means. They just get on with doing it. So we were asking, basically in this research, which of these, if any, or any other leadership qualities, might actually be changing or evolving in the light of the social media revolution. What, for example, does it mean to develop trust using social media? We live in an era of fake news. People read something and can choose to discard it. So how do we develop trust using social media? That was the initial thought behind the research. The model we used was a simple one. We took, trying to use those three dimensions, we found the model put forward by UNICON, Gordon and Tabor in 2002 fitted our needs best. There were simply those three dimensions, if you like: getting the job done, getting the task done, managing it through people and relationships, and moving things forward. So very much reflecting those three dimensions of leadership on the previous slide. We devised a survey and an interview protocol covering 6 behavioural categories. We didn't want it to be too long, so we took 2 categories for each of those 3 dimensions. Under the task dimension, we had clarifying roles and responsibilities, and target setting and monitoring performance. I know there is an argument that says those are management roles, not leadership roles, but actually most leaders have to do these things as well. So we thought it was an appropriate dimension to look at. Under relationship, we looked at developing and empowering others to act. Absolutely key leadership function, we think, to help others to achieve. And we also had encouraging, recognizing and rewarding the contributions of others. Again, key leadership role. And under the change function, we had inspiring and communicating the shared vision, and challenging the status quo and taking risks. There is quite a lot of research that says leaders are leading when they are managing change, when they're challenging the way we've always done things. And if leaders aren't doing that, then they are simply managing. So we thought this was a relatively robust framework, easy to understand, easy to access, and easy to research. So this was the one we went with. So Viki now is going to take over and talk about the actual project that we conducted. Quite briefly, it lasted over 18 months, so there was quite a lot of material. She's going to tell you the bones of it, if you like. So over to you, Viki.
Thank you, Patricia. So on this slide, you can see we've got the, at the top, we've got the research questions that we were talking about earlier with Patricia, how the key attributes of leadership are being reshaped through social media use, and whether, if that is happening, and we didn't definitely know that that was happening when we started, but if that was happening, then whether we needed new approaches to leadership development. So in terms of our research approach, we used 4 different ways to collect our data. Initially, we started off with a number of inquiry sessions. Some of these were online, some were run as face-to-face workshops, with some 42 participants. And these were people who we particularly were interested to get close to. So they were either senior academics who were very closely linked to leadership practice in large organisations, or they were in the learning and development community. So in that case, they were designing and delivering leadership executive education themselves. So they were a really helpful group of people. They had expert knowledge and they could tell us about the current scenarios that leadership teams and chief executives were thinking about in terms of social media. So as Patricia mentioned earlier, we heard lots of opportunities, but we also heard about lots of challenges in terms of senior leaders. And then as well as that, we did some focus groups with executive MBA participants, and our colleague Anthony Turner ran those in the States. We did an online electronic survey with over 86 respondents. And then we also had some in-depth interviews with 10 senior managers. And although that's not a very big group to interview, I think we were really fortunate because we had some very different experiences in there. So we had, for instance, one senior leader who began at a stage where he didn't have time for social media and couldn't really see the point of it, and then moved gradually through his own experiences to somebody who's now absolutely fundamentally passionate about the value social media can bring to effective leadership. And another person we interviewed was ahead of the curve in his health sector organisation. So he was doing things, bringing them in from his own private experiences to introduce them with his team into the rest of the organisation. So again, he could see a very different perspective for us, and that was helpful. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see here some of the social media options that we were asking them about. So most of those I think that you'll be aware of. So we asked about the platforms and what purpose they used them for. We asked about frequency. And although we were primarily interested about what was happening within organisations, we also found a number of the people we talked to and the experiences within our inquiry sessions where people were using social media slightly differently within the organisation compared to outside of the organisation. And the boundary lines there were sometimes blurred and sometimes quite difficult even for the individuals to cope with. It's a huge space and it was really interesting discussions that we had there. So let me show you here something about the analysis of our results. So we divided it here in two sections. At the bottom, we've got the qualitative data. We'll come to that in just a moment. But if we look at the quantitative data that we got from the survey results, then we took three particular question sets. If I just explain those to you. First of all, we asked people what they thought effective leadership looked like. Then we asked them about what they thought leaders were using social media for. And then we also went back to their own personal experience, their own view of how confident they were in using social media. So there were some things that we expected and some surprises. The first one is that there was a significant correlation between the number of platforms, the number of sites people were using, and their own self-reported confidence in the ability to use it in terms of change and relational attributes of leadership. And I suppose you could see there that perhaps the more you're using sites, then the better you get, the more that improves your confidence. But we think it's probably not just that, but it's perhaps that if you're on different platforms, they're doing different things, they're reaching different audiences, and you're changing your message. You're changing the essence of your leadership according to the people that you're trying to reach. And so that gives you the kind of self-confidence that people were telling us about. The second point there was a surprise, that we didn't find any significant correlation between age and the leadership questions. But clearly that's something that is worth exploring a bit more. What we did also find from the data was that relations and change behaviour factors together and that task behaviours seem to be slightly more independent. So it seems that social media is playing more to the strengths of relational behaviours, which again is what you might have expected if we've been saying to you, well, what do you think we would find in the survey data? But what was really good for us is that we also heard that our model of leadership was accepted, and people seemed to find it relevant and useful when we talked in the interviews and in the discussion groups. So if we look a little bit more about the qualitative data that's at the bottom of the slide, it was interesting that there's a very different level of use in terms of social media. So not just how many platforms people were using, but how much time they would spend on it. So for instance, in the survey, it could be 30 minutes a day, whereas some of the people we interviewed were using it continuously, who it's almost an immediate part. It's used on an hourly basis within their leadership practice. As mentioned above with the statistics, we could see that relation management was being used more with social media than the task-orientated behaviours. We could see that it's changing attributes of leadership. So people talked about how communication is different and how it's changing what they're doing and how they're doing it. And it's got to be faster, for instance, than it was before. But it's also that social media plays well to establishing your brand, your thought leadership views, either within the organisation or externally, especially when you're talking to different groups of people if you're becoming an influencer. And a number of the people that we spoke to, that we interviewed, were doing that as well as their role within the organisation. And then, as Patricia has mentioned, it's clearly about changing attributes of followership. They're not only followers, they're coming alongside in terms of that redistribution of power. They have more choices, but clearly the sort of accepted hierarchy within any organisation still plays a big role in who they choose to follow, but it is a dynamic. It is really, really changing the game set, I think. And then some leaders saw as many challenges as opportunities. So we've got things like the issue of authenticity, how much you share across your personal and private boundary, and then the worry about privacy, and I think a real concern about how toxic social media can be outside. And we've seen that in the celebrity world, we see it in the political world. I think in every country we've seen that. So that was a big concern for people. So shall I pass back to you, Patricia, here?
Just picking up on what Viki has said there, some of the tensions and the paradoxes we heard of, which we would need to factor into any developmental intervention. First of all, the reach of social media is fantastic. You can reach second, third, fourth levels of stakeholders. But people who are media savvy now expect their communications to be individually targeted. You know, they can choose what they allow into their own communicative space. So you've got to be able to target it individually, but to have mass appeal. And that's really quite a communication skill that a lot of leaders haven't had yet time to develop yet. Secondly, Viki's mentioned this concept of sharing. Social media expects a certain openness and transparency. And people who are effective users of social media are excellent at this. However, a lot of people still want some privacy, and managing that boundary is a concern for many. And this is somewhere we did hear about an age difference here. Younger leaders are much less likely to feel the need to maintain privacy boundaries than older leaders. But it is something that we would need to consider when developing people. Choosing the right channel, that's a fairly hard technical skill, if you like. Different groups of people use different platforms. I understand now that nobody above the age of 35 uses Facebook. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But obviously, to use these platforms skillfully, you need to be able to target. We heard that some people are nervous that using social media to expound one's opinions is simply banging your own drum, and it's only going to be listened to by people who are receptive to that. So it's not helpful for communication, it's simply self-validation. We heard the concerns over misinterpretation, over confidentiality, and this, I will come to it a little bit later, but this actually is a key one, this confidentiality, because there's an additional responsibility now for leaders to be mindful of the amount of information they can hold about their people, about their teams. And that responsibility of leadership, I think, is something that we need to become more and more aware of. This we heard a lot of. Social media requires immediate response, otherwise it's lost in the ether. And people were nervous about knee-jerk messages, which give the instant response, which gets attention, which is influential, but which may be less thoughtful or contemplative than they would like. So that short-termism may lead to a lack of thought for longer-term thinking or careful strategic thought. And that's something, again, that we need to balance very carefully. This next point, leaders can't be sure their message will get to everybody. Management of the platforms is important, but so is continued traditional communication. So it's another burden, really, for leaders. It's something else they've got to do. It's not instead of, it's as well as. The intimacy of communication, this business of followers choosing, and the phrase I've used, they allow communications into their personal space. That's a really important one. Leaders have got to be able to understand what will land, what will appeal. Otherwise, their communications on social media will just disappear. And this last point, it's slightly academic in a way, but I think it's an interesting one. Viki has mentioned this thought leadership, and it does appear that to be an effective leader today in the social media world, if you are seen as a thought leader, then you are seen as an effective leader. Now, that means having your views online, being open, being transparent, sharing. And that really plays to this great man approach that I mentioned earlier, where leadership resides in those individuals. But at the same time, the balance of power is shifting. We mentioned that people are choosing who to follow. People are expecting to be listened to and to have their voice heard. So there's a real tension here between what's happening to the way we think about leadership. Two different strengths, if you like, in what's happening. I'm not sure what that means for leadership development, except flexibility, adaptability, and perhaps we have to continue along the line of no one size fits all in any situation. Just to reinforce some of the results that we heard earlier, it's quite clear here when we ask people to what extent and how often are they using social media, we can see that those relationship pieces are much more important than the task pieces, the target setting and monitoring performance. So those two task things at the top, roles and responsibilities, target setting, less than once a month. And right at the bottom, we see that inspiring, communicating a shared vision and encouraging and rewarding the others is being used daily by some of our samples. So it's very much a relationship management tool, if you like, or a relationship enhancing tool. So it's very important in this relational thinking about leadership that we do acknowledge the opportunities that are offered here. So some of the headline findings: it is being used by leaders for key functions, but not all leaders feel confident. It is unique, it focuses on personal strengths. Leaders must demonstrate thought leadership. I've mentioned a return to the great man. Leadership's clearly about the ability to influence. Emotional engagement is absolutely key. Targeted listening is key as well. And this is this capacity to have both intimate and high-level conversations is a new leadership skill. It's not sufficient to be able to relate to your people. That relationship management has to have a much broader network in order to land today. The balance of power, I've mentioned that. People are choosing who and what to follow. This distributed power is key. And that has implications for the nature of followership. And therefore, if we're talking about leadership being a relationship between leaders and followers, if followers change, leadership must change by definition. And this transparency from leaders, this blurring of personal and private boundaries, we kept coming back to this. Some people see this as very negative, as a real risk, and others just take that in their stride. So in brief, what remains the same? Leadership is leadership. Those three dimensions of leadership functioning are the same. All of that is similar. The importance of authenticity, managing relationships, influencing, communicating, all of those remain the same, but things have changed. The distance between leaders and followers is potentially much closer. Leaders must be as open to receive as well as to send. The breadth of reach is bigger. We talked about that. Communication is faster, and followers can now be as powerful as leaders. So those things have changed. So what does that mean for what we think about leadership? So if we go to some quotes, we're beginning to see that leaders acknowledge the potentially enhancing nature of the influence they can have if they use it. So wider dissemination, easier to get the messages out there. The other side of that, getting things done is easier, but leaders are more accountable. So that brings in this area that I did mention a little bit earlier, this concept of responsibility, understanding what you do with that data that you have access to, basically thinking about what your leadership values are. And I think that's where it takes us into our implications for future leadership development. And we think there are 6 key ones that have come out of this study. We have for quite a long time understood that it's important for leaders to be self-aware. It's important for their own development. It's important for them to understand the impact they have on others. It's increasingly important now. Not only is authenticity demanded, but inauthenticity is easy to detect because there is so much out there. If there is incongruence between personal and public personas, there is no trust. So leaders need to be very clear about why they're leading, what their leadership values are, how those are impacting on their decisions. This self-awareness has got to be what leads to integrity and authenticity through those 2 public and personal personas. So an increased focus on leaders' self-awareness we think is critical. And we think this shouldn't be a luxury for senior leaders. This needs to be all the way down through an organizational hierarchy. It also has to extend to an awareness of leadership goals and purpose. 2 reasons. First of all, leaders are having to make decisions in the moment, closer to the decision-making point. They have got to understand how each decision relates to organizational strategy and goals. So that immediacy of decision-making that they're going to have to make has got to be rooted in a thorough understanding of organizational goals. The further down the organization decision-making goes, the more important it is that strategic awareness, fundamental awareness of how everybody's role fits into the organizational strategy is critical. And again, I think strategic awareness is something we save for senior leaders. In our work here at Ashridge in Executive Education, very often the strategy courses are for the more senior guys, whereas more junior leaders are seen as strategic implementers, but actually they're having to make decisions. They're having to make decisions in the moment. They're expected to make decisions. They need to have that strategic awareness. We've called filter management the 3rd skill or the 3rd development area. There is so much information out there. People have got to be helped to prioritize. And there's some hardcore skills here. Decision making, strategic capability I've mentioned, time management, really hard-nosed technical skills, which we've kind of lost sight of a little bit. Leadership development has gone very much on the soft skills side of things, and that's absolutely fine. We've got to have that, but we need to bring back hardcore technical skills as a balance. Oh, sorry, I've said a little bit about this here. But in order to make the most of the digital communicative technology, understanding big data, for example, will give leaders a competitive edge. Understanding how to manage all those platforms, understanding how to switch between platforms, all of these things. And obviously, not everybody needs all of this, but they do need some of it. And we have stopped, in a way, teaching these things. Obviously, it needs to be balanced. And so this is something else for leaders to get their heads around. Not only do they have to be techie, it's not enough now to say, oh, I don't do technology. Now they have to do tech. It's everywhere. But they've got to be able to do the traditional leadership skills as well. I mentioned the ethical side of things. The increased availability of information is increased responsibility for leaders. And I think in today's world where sustainability, responsibility is becoming so front of mind, I think our leadership development needs to put this front of mind as well. It goes back to my first point. Why are people leading? What are their leadership values? Being aware of that helps to make sure that decisions are in line with values. Now, I don't believe, or I have no evidence to believe, that we can help people to be better people, to be more ethical people. But I think we can certainly help them to understand the ethical dimensions to all their leadership decisions. And I believe we must be doing that more and more in the future. And interconnectivity, we now have this enormous reach. Our network is so broad. How to manage that ethically when we will be working perhaps with people across boundaries where goals will be different, but respecting the goals of others is an ethical issue. I think this is something that we can't ignore. Network analysis is part of that. Again, that's a hard skill. Interdependencies, connectivity, collaboration. I think these are the buzzwords for the future. We're being asked more and more to help our leaders to connect. And the old words of, networking skills are no longer relevant. Networking skills used to be moving around a social function with a fistful of business cards. It's not that anymore. It's really understanding interdependencies. It's the fourth industrial revolution, where the boundaries between biology, technology, and social skills are becoming blurred. We have to build all this in. So that's the easy bit. How do we do it? How do we go and develop these skills? Well, interestingly enough, when we talked to our interviewees about how to move on this front, the answer was, it's got to be more simulations. It's got to be more virtual worlds. And they do have their place. They do have their place without a doubt, partly because they involve familiarity with digital technology, but also because they offer so many different modes of development. But other things are equally important. I've mentioned self-awareness, reflection, lifelong learning, psychometrics plus personal coaching. The importance of feedback in this relational world can't be overestimated. Giving and receiving feedback is critical to understanding impact and influence. Managing upwards is something we've talked about a lot, needs to be part of a core skill set. Becoming transparent, how you develop trust in this sort of world is something I mentioned right at the beginning of this presentation. And I don't have an answer, except that it is around this area of transparency, personal disclosure, protecting self in a way, but becoming more open to giving, receiving feedback, asking for feedback, but disclosing as well. Those of you familiar with the trust equation, for example, will know that what diminishes trust is self-interest. And I think that takes me back to this concept of interdependency and networking. We all have goals to achieve. We all have targets. We would need to work across boundaries with people who have different targets. And developing an ability to manage that, I think, is something that we need to be really putting some research effort behind. How can we do that? How can we manage, if you like, self-organizing communities of interests that allow leadership towards specific goals whilst not endangering others? Selective skills development, I've mentioned. Best practice role models is a good way, identifying people. As part of our research, we did identify some significant business leaders, and we developed little vignettes, and people found those very helpful. Oh yeah, that's what they do. That's what I'd like to do as well. So not a complete list, I'm hoping. I would very much like to hear from you, from our participants, to see if anybody has any other ideas as to how we can develop the skills that I've been talking about. I think this phrase I've just put in at the bottom there, that it's not just enough to be on social media. It's got to be part of leadership. Like we say, listening is part of leadership. Like we say, empathizing is part of leadership. Using these communication tools has to be part of leadership in order to enhance potential effectiveness. We asked people, can social media make a leader more or less effective? And as you can see, some people think so and others don't. It's still a very mixed bag. I think our view is that this tool is not going to go away. It's a powerful tool. We should help our leaders to get the most out of it. And we should be thinking about what our leadership development curricula need to offer in order to do that. So I'd like to pause there and ask Viki if I left anything out. Put her on the spot for a moment. Did I leave anything out? What do you think?
I don't think so. There was one interesting angle in terms of how you develop the social media expertise. I think that we did come across, but we probably haven't brought it out in any of our slides. And that was where companies introduced a reverse mentoring program. So, for instance, where younger digital savvy members of staff were tutoring, coaching, shall we say, senior people. And in one company that we found, the first person who volunteered to do this was the chief executive. And once he did it, it was a he, I have to say, but everybody else on the senior leadership team felt that it was okay to be a learner again. And I think that's something perhaps that we need to think about in terms of how we offer development changes, that it's not a remedial process, but it actually helps them to become more effective, which is the goal for any company, any leadership team.
That's really helpful, Viki. Thank you. So as you can see, Dan has said, please turn on your mics. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We'd love to hear your suggestions, not only for perhaps developmental interventions we could work on, but where we could take this research next. Our instinct is to have a look at that network collaboration piece, to see how we can help future leaders to really optimize the networks that they can reach and make the most of it in this world of responsibility and sustainable leadership. Any thoughts would be very welcome.
And the slide set has jammed again.
Slide set has jammed again. That's just me.
I think we're okay.
I think we're okay. Yeah.
Patricia and Viki, thank you very much for leading us through that very informative, very interesting webinar. As you mentioned, we have opened the microphones at this point to take any questions and answers. While we're waiting for some of those to come in, one of the questions I had in listening to your presentation is around the polarization of social media and how that might limit leaders from reaching a wider audience. We very often hear about how it's kind of self-selecting and people use or listen to the channels that align with their own interests. In your research, what did you discover about how leaders are able to kind of break through this polarization or respond to that challenge?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dan. Thank you. We did hear from some leaders that they were worried exactly about that, that they would just be speaking to their own, and it wouldn't help them reach other people. So the only people who would select to follow them would be those who were sort of very receptive to their message. I think again, it's just a confidence in reaching out to different groups. I work with a lot of very talented academics who I've heard say, oh, I've had this really good idea, or I've done this piece of research, it's fascinating. I don't want to put it on LinkedIn. People think I'm just blowing my own trumpet, and it's not what I want to do. It's overcoming that. It's beginning to understand that this is it's like the invention of the printing press. You know, nobody was reading stuff before that. This is now the way we communicate. It's got to be a tool that's used. A leader who doesn't read now is in difficulty, and a leader who doesn't use social media will be in difficulty in the future. I'm not sure that's quite answered your question, Dan, because there was a little bit of interference as you started.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. It's Rob, and yes, that was answered it perfectly. Any other questions from the audience? You're able to use your microphone, or you can submit your question via the chat box on your navigation panel as well.
I can't hear that at all.
Is somebody speaking?
Yeah.
I think it's background noise. I think somebody has their microphone open, but might have some noise in the back.
Okay.
While we're waiting for questions from the audience, another question I thought of is kind of the accelerated time frame for social media, and that I think now the cycle to respond to events and to create something faster in the news cycle very much aligns with social media, but also maybe challenges or limits just in the format, how you might be able to address more complex issues. Any thoughts? At one point, your slides talked about being able to reinforce with traditional media. Any thoughts of that balance between simple and fast messaging and the challenges in conveying more complex messaging?
I think that is absolutely critical, absolutely critical. That on two fronts, really. First of all, that need for immediate response does, as we found, it tempts a lack of thought. It tempts a reactivity, a knee-jerk reactivity that's not ideal. But if it's not an immediate response, it doesn't get noticed. So it's got to be there. However, it mustn't be at the expense of longer-term, careful strategic thinking, which is why this self-awareness and strategic awareness piece is so important for leaders. They have got to be able to make that knee-jerk response, to make that instant response, knowing that it is in line and it has integrity when put alongside the longer-term strategy and the longer-term objectives of the leadership. So the two go hand in hand, and they have to be balanced with an ability to manage one-to-one relationships. You know, leadership is in the relationship. This is another dimension to those relationships, and it's one that we shouldn't ignore, but it's not instead of, it's as well as. So we're asking more of our leaders, but I think that's inevitable in our ever more complicated and turbulent world.
Thank you. A question related to leadership or leaders' profiles on social media. Did you encounter any leaders that were concerned about, as they were entering social media, maybe how their position might be viewed, or concerns about low following, that in order to get started, they're kind of starting from zero, trying to build a base and followers? We hear so much about the importance for influencers to have large followings. How are leaders dealing with those concerns and how they're growing their profiles online? Any sense of that from the research?
I think that's hugely important, and I think that is why a lot of leaders don't use social media as effectively as they could, because they're actually nervous about not having enough followers. But that's very telling, isn't it? Because if you are nervous about that, if you have a lack of confidence about that, by implication, you're saying that leaders with a big following are more influential and better at it than I am, who don't have that following. And here it's not just down to the leaders. This is where there is an organizational responsibility to support and develop leaders in their use of this. As Viki's example, the chief exec does it. The chief exec says, I'm not very good at it, help me out. There are lots of people who can help with this, but it is important. It's not a skill that we're born with, or at least not all of us are born with. And people do need to be supported, to be given confidence, to show how it works so that they can have that visibility that makes them influential. It won't happen without organizational support.
Thank you. We're approaching the top of the hour. Are there any other final questions from anybody in the audience before we conclude today's webinar? If not, then Patricia, Viki, I'd just like to thank you again for leading us through today's webinar. Very informative. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, it has been recorded, so you'll soon, people that were on the line will be getting a link to the recording as well as details on how to download the slides. I encourage you all to stay tuned for additional webinars and topics. And again, with the current situation that we're in around the world right now, if you have questions about UNICON events or research or conferences, I encourage you to visit the UNICON website for continuing updates. But again, big thanks to both of you, Patricia and Viki, for helping us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at future UNICON events.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all those who attended.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.